I am using a voice transcription application on my mobile phone to record this because I have never been very good at typing, and I usually struggle to find the right words when I am staring at a blank computer screen. This whole thing happened about 7 or 8 years ago now, although sometimes it feels like it happened just yesterday, and other times it feels like a completely different lifetime. My life has been pretty chaotic since then, so my head is constantly filled with all sorts of strange memories and random thoughts. This particular incident took place on New Year's Eve, back when I was still dating my ex-girlfriend, whose name was Duda. We were on our way back from a holiday party when everything went completely wrong. It must have been well after midnight, because I remember feeling incredibly tired, and my eyes were burning from staring at the road for so long. Driving on New Year's Eve is generally a very bad idea, but we really did not have any other choice that night. The party had been at a house belonging to one of Duda's close friends, but we were added to the guest list at the very last minute, which meant there were no sleeping arrangements left for us. Every bed, couch, and even the floor space was already claimed by other guests who had planned ahead. The drive back to Duda's apartment was quite long, probably about 30 minutes or so, depending on the road conditions. The streets were almost completely empty, which made me feel a bit better, because it had snowed heavily earlier that afternoon. The roads were covered in a thick layer of black ice, and the last thing I wanted to deal with was navigating through heavy traffic while trying to keep my car from sliding off the road. Duda was half asleep in the passenger seat, with her head resting against the cold window. I had the car heater turned up as high as it would go, and I was playing a random rock playlist on my phone just to keep myself awake and alert. We were only about 10 minutes away from her apartment when the situation turned into an absolute nightmare. I still do not fully understand how to describe what I saw next. One second, the dark road ahead of us was completely empty, and the next second there was a woman standing directly in the middle of the street. She was not trying to cross the road or walk to the other side. She was just standing there, perfectly still, facing my car as if she had been waiting for us to arrive. My brain simply could not process the image fast enough. I was already slamming my foot down on the brakes before I even consciously realized what I was looking at. As the headlights of my car illuminated her, I realized she was holding a massive kitchen knife down by her side. It was the kind of long, heavy knife you would use to carve a turkey. Her face was completely twisted up in what looked like extreme pain or anger, and she looked like she was either crying or screaming at the top of her lungs, though I couldn't hear her over the sound of my engine. It was an incredibly unsettling sight. I reacted on pure instinct, pulling the steering wheel sharply to the right to avoid hitting her. The moment I swerved, the woman suddenly lunged forward toward my car. I heard a loud, metallic scraping sound against the driver's side door before I could even process what she was doing. She had actually swung the heavy knife at my car as we passed her. Between the sudden swerve and the thick ice on the road, my car immediately lost all traction. The tires started spinning uselessly, and the vehicle began to slide completely out of control. Duda woke up instantly and started screaming in terror. I gripped the steering wheel as hard as I could, desperately trying to steer into the slide, but the car was not responding to anything I did. We spun around in a full circle and finally came to a halt facing the opposite direction. Once the initial shock of almost crashing wore off, I looked through the windshield and felt a deep wave of nausea. Because our car had spun around, we were now facing back toward the direction we had just come from, and the headlights were shining directly on the woman. She was about 30 feet away from us, still holding the massive kitchen knife. She was limping slowly toward us, moving with a strange, uneven gait, as if she had been seriously injured. She was screaming something at us, but it did not sound like real words. It was a guttural, animalistic noise that did not sound human at all. It was easily the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life. Duda was shaking violently and screaming at me to do something, but my body was completely frozen. I could not take my eyes off this woman as she slowly advanced toward us. Her clothes were incredibly dirty and torn, and her hair was matted and wild. I had no idea if she was under the influence of drugs, experiencing a severe mental health crisis, or something else entirely. There was absolutely nothing behind her eyes. They looked completely vacant, like she was a dead person walking. When she got within 15 feet of the front bumper, my survival instincts finally broke through my paralysis. I threw the car into drive and slammed my foot down on the accelerator. For a terrifying second, the tires just spun on the ice, making a loud whining noise, but then they finally gripped the road, and the car surged forward. I thought we were going to get away safely, but I was completely wrong. I do not know how she managed to move so quickly. One moment she was standing in front of the car, and the next moment she was on top of it. She threw her body onto the hood of the car with a heavy thud that shook the entire vehicle. Duda was screaming at the top of her lungs, and I was cursing loudly as I tried to steer. The woman was clinging to the hood with her left hand, while using her right hand to repeatedly stab the windshield with the kitchen knife. She was staring directly at me through the glass. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me feel like she was going to break through and kill us both. I began swerving the car back and forth across the road as hard as I could, trying to throw her off the hood. She was sliding around on the metal, but she refused to let go, all while continuing that horrible, wordless screaming. On my third or fourth sharp turn, she finally lost her grip. I watched her body roll off the side of the hood, hit the frozen pavement hard, and slide into the dark ditch at the side of the road. I managed to regain control of the car and keep it on the street. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw her lying motionless in the ditch. A small part of me wanted to stop the car. Even though she had just tried to kill us, I was terrified that I had just taken someone's life. I thought that maybe she was just a severely ill person who needed medical help. But Duda grabbed my arm tightly, shaking her head, and told me that we had to leave immediately. She kept repeating that it was not our problem and that we could not afford to get involved. I argued that we should at least call the police, but Duda shut that idea down instantly. She said the police would never believe our story, especially since we had both been drinking at the party, and we would end up getting arrested. Duda had a way of making her arguments sound completely logical and urgent in the moment, even when they were incredibly manipulative. I ended up listening to her. I drove her back to her apartment, went home, and never told a single soul about what happened that night. I still feel a deep sense of guilt and sickness whenever I think about it. The physical damage to my car was surprisingly minor. There was a cracked windshield, some deep knife scratches on the driver's side window, and a few minor marks on the hood. There was not even any blood on the car. I got the windshield and window repaired about a week later, but the emotional weight stayed with me for a very long time. I spent months checking the local news websites, waiting to see a report about a body found on that road, but nothing ever appeared. What really bothered me was how quickly Duda moved on. Within just 2 days, she was back to her normal routine, making plans with her friends, and acting as if nothing had happened. When I tried to bring it up to her, she got annoyed and told me I was being overly dramatic. I remember looking at her and wondering how she could possibly be so cold and unfeeling about something so traumatic. We broke up a few months later, and while it was for unrelated reasons, that night permanently changed the way I viewed her. This brings me to my second story, which happened just last New Year's Eve. I attended the University of California, Berkeley, for my undergraduate degree. That was where I met one of my absolute best friends, a guy named Garrett. His real name is actually Guo, but when we first met during our freshman year, he introduced himself by his American name, and it just stuck. He was originally from Hong Kong and had come to the United States to study computer science. He is easily one of the smartest and most talented people I have ever known. After we graduated, we ended up moving to different parts of the world. I moved to New York City for a job in finance, and he moved back to Hong Kong to work for a technology firm. We are both in our late 20s now, doing well in our careers, and we are both single. We make an effort to see each other at least once or twice a year, either by him flying to New York or me taking a trip over to Asia. To understand this story, you have to keep in mind that Hong Kong is exactly 13 hours ahead of New York City. That means when it is midnight on New Year's Eve in Hong Kong, it is only 11 o'clock in the morning on December 31st in New York. Garrett celebrates both the Standard New Year and the Chinese New Year, so he was out partying half a day before I even started getting ready for my night. I spent my New Year's Eve with two of my closest local friends, Ryland and Ari. We started the evening at Ryland's apartment for some drinks, and then we headed over to a rooftop party in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. One of Aries' coworkers had invited us, and it turned out to be a really nice, upscale event. Around 11:30, I noticed a girl standing by herself near the bar. I walked over and introduced myself, and we immediately hit it off. She had an incredible energy that made her extremely easy to talk to. She was funny, engaging, and very charismatic. After talking for just a few minutes, she grabbed my hand and pulled me onto the crowded dance floor. Her name was Maitre. I had never heard that name before, so I had to ask her to repeat it. She laughed and told me that most people just call her Maitre because that is how it is pronounced. She even took a pen out of her purse and wrote her name on the back of my hand so I would not forget it. We ended up dancing together, talking for hours, and we shared a kiss right at midnight. Around 12:30, she asked if I wanted to leave the party and go back to my apartment in the East Village. We took an Uber back to my place, and we had an incredible night together. Afterward, we stayed up for a long time just talking, and I ended up learning a lot of specific details about her life. She told me she was originally from San Diego, California. She was a professional artist, specifically a painter, and she mentioned that she used to do street art and graffiti before moving on to more traditional canvas work. Her middle name was Mia, which was also the name of one of her cats. Her other cat was named Cosmo. Her birthday was on April 28th. She also mentioned that her best friend from childhood grew up in a tiny town in Germany called Hillesheim, and that her father worked as a patent lawyer. These seemed like completely normal, random details at the time, but they became incredibly important later on. At some point during the night, she complained that her clothes smelled strongly of cigarette smoke and alcohol from the party. So I offered to put them in my washing machine. She borrowed one of my old t-shirts to sleep in, and we eventually fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, she was completely gone. At first, I did not think it was that unusual. People often leave quickly after a casual hookup to avoid any awkward morning conversations. But then I started noticing things that made absolutely no sense. The first thing was the lock on my front door. My apartment has a heavy, old-fashioned deadbolt that can only be locked from the outside by using a physical key. It does not lock automatically when you close the door. When I went to the door, I found that the deadbolt was fully locked. This meant that she had somehow locked the door from the outside without a key, or she had never actually left the apartment at all. I searched my entire apartment. It is a very small place, consisting of just one bedroom, one bathroom, a small living room, and a tiny kitchen. There is no back exit, and the windows are painted shut and can only open a few inches. I even checked the back of my closet, feeling ridiculous, but there was no one there. Her clothes were also gone from the dryer, and the t-shirt I had lent her was nowhere to be found. She had somehow vanished from a fully locked apartment. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to make sense of what had happened, but I could not find a logical explanation. To make things worse, I realized I had never gotten her phone number or any of her social media information. Later that afternoon, I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to call Garrett in Hong Kong. We chatted for a bit about our jobs and how we had spent our New Year's Eve. Garrett sounded unusually quiet and downcast, so I asked him what was wrong. He sighed and told me that he had met an amazing girl the night before. They had gone back to his apartment, but when he woke up, she had disappeared without leaving a phone number or saying goodbye. I laughed and told him that the exact same thing had just happened to me in New York. But then Garrett told me her name was Maitre. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I asked him to describe her, and as he spoke, every single detail matched perfectly. He told me she was a painter from San Diego who used to do graffiti. Her birthday was April 28th. Her middle name was Mia. Her cats were named Mia and Cosmo. Her best friend was from Germany, and her dad was a patent lawyer. I asked him if he had any photos of her, and he sent me several pictures they had taken together at the party in Hong Kong. It was the exact same girl. There was absolutely no doubt about it, but the math of the situation was completely impossible. Garrett had met her at 11 o'clock on New Year's Eve in Hong Kong, and I had met her at 11:30 on New Year's Eve in New York. Because of the 13-hour time difference, she was with Garrett in Hong Kong at the exact same time she was with me in Manhattan. Even if she had access to a private jet, a flight between the two cities takes at least 15 hours. It was physically impossible for her to be in both places. We have talked about this dozens of times since then, but we have never been able to find an answer. She simply vanished from both of our lives, leaving us with a mystery we will never solve. This final story is one that my father told me, and it took place long before my siblings and I were born. Back in his mid-20s, my dad made some very smart investments and found himself with a lot of disposable income and free time. He and my mother loved to go skiing, but the only decent ski slopes near New York City were located up in Vermont. Over the course of a few years, they ended up purchasing a couple of different winter properties up there. The first house they bought was in a small town called Ludlow. They purchased it from a businessman named Mr. Black, who lived on West End Avenue in New York. The house had distinctive black shutters, and my dad always referred to it as the Black House, both because of its appearance and because of the previous owner's name. They would often sell quarter shares of the property to their friends to help cover the maintenance costs, and they kept that place for several years. Eventually, they decided to sell the Black House and buy a different property. The second lodge was located about halfway between Ludlow and Rutland, right along Route 100, in an area that the locals call the Lake District. There are 5 beautiful lakes lined up in a row along that particular stretch of highway, and this new house sat right on the shoreline of one of them. My dad's college friend Victor and his wife Lisa decided to buy into this property with them. The 4 of them would drive up to Vermont together, almost every weekend during the winter season. This particular event occurred on New Year's Eve. My mother and Lisa were away in another state, attending a wedding for a childhood friend. So my dad and Victor decided to take a guys-only trip up to the lake house to do some skiing and celebrate the new year. On the night of December 31st, the 2 of them were sitting in the upstairs living room of the lodge. The upstairs area had massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked directly out over the frozen lake. It was a very peaceful night, and a gentle snow was falling outside, covering the ice in a clean sheet of white. They were drinking beer, listening to music on the radio, and waiting for the midnight countdown from Times Square. Suddenly, a massive flash of bright light illuminated the entire area. It came from somewhere on the far side of the lake, but it did not look like a firework because the light came directly from the ground and shot upward. There was no sound associated with it at all, just a silent, blinding flash that made the entire living room light up as if it were daytime. Victor immediately stood up and walked over to the glass window, pressing his face against the pane to see what was happening outside. My dad asked him what he was looking at, and Victor replied that he thought he saw something moving out on the ice. Even though it was very dark, the fresh snow on the frozen lake reflected enough ambient light that you could see shapes if you stared closely. After a few moments, Victor became absolutely convinced that there was a person standing out on the middle of the lake. My dad told him that was impossible. The far side of the lake was completely undeveloped. There were no cabins, no hiking trails, and no roads over there, just dense, untouched forest. But Victor refused to ignore it. He started putting on his heavy winter coat and boots, saying he was going to go outside and investigate. My dad tried to convince him to stay inside, but Victor was already heading down the stairs, so my dad grabbed his own coat and followed him out. The moment they stepped out onto the back deck, they heard a voice coming from the darkness. It sounded like a young child, a little boy, crying out for help. The voice was faint but very clear, repeating the word over and over again. The lake had been frozen solid for months, so there was no danger of the ice breaking. Without hesitation, my dad and Victor started walking out onto the ice toward the sound of the voice. As they walked farther from the house, they could clearly see the silhouette of a small child standing on the ice, about 30 yards away from the far shoreline. But before they could reach him, another massive flash of light occurred. It was so bright and sudden that my dad had to cover his eyes and drop to his knees on the ice. When he finally opened his eyes a few seconds later, the child was completely gone. There were no footprints in the snow other than their own, and the ice was completely empty. Terrified by what they had just witnessed, my dad and Victor turned around and began running back toward the safety of the lodge. Victor was running slightly ahead of my dad when he suddenly stopped, pointed up at the second-floor window of the house, and let out a gasp. He claimed that he saw a little boy standing behind the glass of the upstairs living room. looking directly down at them. My dad looked up at the window, but saw nothing but the dark reflection of the snow. They ran inside the house, locked the heavy wooden door behind them, and searched every single room. They checked the closets, the basement, and all of the bedrooms, but the house was completely empty. All of the windows and doors were securely locked from the inside, and there was no indication that anyone had entered. They decided to go to bed, both of them too unsettled to talk about what they had seen. My dad woke up twice during the night, and both times he distinctly heard the sound of a child laughing softly somewhere in the hallway. He lay frozen in his bed, listening intently, but the laughter always stopped before he could muster the courage to open his door. They cut their trip short the next morning and drove back to New York. They never spoke about that night to my mother or Lisa, and my dad still has no explanation for the blinding light or the child on the lake. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.